All right, and then I'll press the record button. Okay, folks, it's 1 o'clock Eastern time. It's 8 o'clock Israel time, and let me wish you all a Chag Sameach, a happy Chanukah, and I hope everyone is enjoying the Chag. I'd like to thank Amichai Tzipor for inviting me to give a Shiur, to give a bit of a presentation on something really a little bit off the beaten path when it comes to regarding Chanukah. But it has to do with a woman named Yehudit, or Judith in English, who is associated with the story of Chanukah in a very nebulous way. And I was hoping that perhaps our objective today, in the next few minutes that we have together, would be to just get some clarity on the role of this woman named Yehudit in the Chanukah story, if indeed she did have a role at all, and why our sages deemed it important, or our rabbis throughout Jewish history since the time of Chanukah deemed it important to include or place on the stage a female protagonist in the Chanukah story, even though at face value there doesn't seem to be an involvement of women in this story of Chanukah. Because after all, when you consider the two main stages of the story of the narrative unfolding, one is in the temple service of the Kohanim, the Hashmonai family, which serves in the temple. This is a male service. There are no female Kohanim who work in the temple. And certainly on the battlefield, fighting the Greeks, this is not a feminine endeavor. There were no women in the army at this time in the ancient world. And so certainly it would seem that the role of women in the story of Chanukah does not play large. And yet for some reason, the Shulchan Aruch tells us that there was a female central figure in the story of Chanukah. And our objective is to try and figure out who that person was, what her role was, and why our sages felt it important to highlight this particular person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you. For those of you who would like to have a copy of the handout that I've just placed on the screen, I invite you to, you can look at the webyeshiva.org website for the course description, and you can download the handout there. Or if you're looking at Facebook and you're looking at the Web Yeshiva Facebook page, you'll notice that one of the comments in the advertisement for this shiur has the link for that PDF as well from the webyeshiva.org website. So the first thing we'd like to look at, hopefully you can see it on your screen, and I hope you don't mind, but I added a couple of sources since actually uploading that PDF. So the last couple of sources are addenda. The first thing that we're going to look at is the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which states as follows: Ribui hasu'udot shemarbim bahem hein su'udot harishut. The first thing the Shulchan Aruch tells us, and this is at the very beginning of Hilchot Chanukah, that there is no requirement to partake in a meal, a festive meal on Chanukah. It is not considered a mitzvah, as it is by contrast on Purim, where one of the four integral mitzvot of the day is to engage in a su'udah, to engage in a festive meal. Shelo kiva'um lemishtevet simcha, because our sages never established Chanukah as a time of rejoicing over food and drink. Now, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't tell us why. The most famous reason for this is cited by the Levush, the 16th century commentary, who tells us that the only time that our sages deemed it important to imbue a holiday with the celebration of a su'udah is when we were under physical threat of annihilation. And that certainly was true in the Purim story. Because our bodies were under threat of destruction, we enhance our bodies and indulge our bodies with the meal. On Chanukah, our physical bodies were not under threat. There was only an attempt to Hellenize Jews, not to execute Jews. And as a result, there is no reason for the rabbis to institute a meal to indulge our bodies because it was really only our souls that were under threat. Now, this reason has been the subject of some discussion. There are other commentaries who disagree with this interpretation, most notably Rabbi David Halevi, the Taz, in his gloss to the Shulchan Aruch, because he feels that our lives were under threat, because if a Jew refused to Hellenize and refused to give up circumcision, Sabbath observance, etc., then their lives were under threat. And so he gives a slightly different reason, the Taz, and he says that when we think about the overt miracle, the most prominent miracle of Purim, it was the fact that our lives were saved. When we think about the most overt miracle of Chanukah, it was not the war with the Greeks, but rather was the light that we lit in the temple, which is purely an esoteric kind of experience, having to do with ritual religious observance, not having to do with annihilating or defeating an enemy. And therefore, that's the reason why we don't have a Su'udah on Chanukah, or there's no requirement for Su'udah, because when we compare the two primary miracles, the primary miracle of Purim is the ability to survive and to thrive and defeat our enemies. The primary miracle of Chanukah, the one that is highlighted the most, is the candles, the ability to reinstate the temple service, and that's not cause for food celebration at our own tables. And finally, we have another reason that's offered by the Bach, the Bayit Chadash, also the father-in-law of Rabbi David Halevi, and he attributes it to the different kinds of reasons why our lives were threatened. In the story of Purim, the reason we were threatened in the first place was as retribution to the Jews for having sinned by partaking of the meal in Shushan. And as a way of atoning for that, we had to do tshuva. We had to repent for the fact that we partook of the meal in Shushan. And part of our penance is that we turn our sinful merrymaking into mitzvah merrymaking. And that's why Purim is a time of merrymaking over a meal to atone for our sinful feasting in the times of Achashverosh. By contrast, there was no sinful merrymaking and feasting in the times of Chanukah, and therefore there's no requirement to have a festive meal. But regardless of the reason, the Shulchan Aruch tells us that there is no requirement. The rabbis never instituted a festive meal on Chanukah. But then Rav Moshe Isserlis, who is responsible for the mostly Ashkenazic practices in the Shulchan Aruch, states as follows: V'yesh omrim sheyesh k'tzat mitzvah b'ribui ha'seudot. Some opine that there is an aspect of feasting on Chanukah, even though it's what he calls k'tzat mitzvah. There's somewhat of a mitzvah aspect of feasting on Chanukah, mishum deba'otan hayamim haya Chanukat hamizbeach. Because since we re-inaugurated the altar in the temple, which is God's table, we signify that by reinstating our own tables with feasting. And then he writes, "V'nohagin lomar zmirot ushvachot b'sudot shemarbim bahem va'azai havei seudat mitzvah." Certainly, if a person adds words of Torah and words of praise at that meal, he has elevated it, according to all opinions, to a Sudat mitzvah. We're not going to deal with that right now. And then the last thing that Rav Moshe Isserlis writes, the Rama writes, is Yesh omrim sheyesh le'echol gvina b'Chanukah. Some say that a person should eat cheese on Chanukah. Lefi shahanes na'aseh b'chalav shehechila Yehudit et ha'oyev. And the reason for this is because there was a miracle that was performed via milk, in that Judith gave milk or milk product to the enemy, period. The source of this halacha is quoted in the name of the Kolbo and the Ran. Both of them are 14th century authorities, and we're going to try to trace how far back this custom goes. If we take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah gives us a very terse historical background who this woman Judith was. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't say who this Judith was. We just know that her name was Yehudit, and she gave dairy product to the enemy, and we don't know anything else from the gloss of the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Berurah tells us that according to tradition, he haita bito shel Yochanan Kohen Gadol. She was the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the head of the Hasmonean family, whose son was Matityahu, whose grandchildren were the Maccabees. And so therefore, she's part of this mishpacha, and v'haita gzeira shekol arusa tiba'el letafsar tchila. And during the time of the Greeks, the Mishnah Berurah tells us, and Mishnah Berurah, of course, is a collection of earlier commentary, that there was at that time an edict that in Latin is known as jus prima noctis. This was a practice that is discussed in the Gemara in certain places, primarily in Masechet Ketuvot, which talks about what day is most propitious for a couple to get married based on this concern. And what it essentially was that in certain times of certain tyrants in Jewish history, the ruler made an edict that before a virgin could get married to her fiance, she had to first spend the night with the tyrant. This has been written up in other contexts outside of Judaism, but Judaism has used this citation historically to enact certain halachic principles having to do with marriage. But apparently, according to this tradition, this woman Judith was also in danger of having to spend the night with a wicked tyrant before her marriage. And in order to avoid this debasing experience, she gave the head of the besiegers, those who were oppressing the Jews, she gave him cheese, lishichruto, to help him become drunk, v'chatcha et rosho ubarchu kulam. She then decapitated him in his drunken state, and the enemy dispersed as a result. And that's all we know from the Mishnah Berurah, that there was this woman named Judith, she decapitated one of the oppressors, and everyone was saved. Now, who is this? Well, it's really not clear how this plays into the story. Let me just also point out that we have a number of texts that go back to the Second Temple period or shortly after the Second Temple period that record the story of Chanukah. We have 4 books of Maccabees. We have something called Megillat Antiochus, which also records the story and is purportedly goes back to a very early period. And none of those texts which discuss the story of Chanukah, we also have the book of Josephus, which describes the Hasmonean dynasty. None of these texts have a record of a woman named Judith from the Hasmonean family having done anything like this. Another perhaps bizarre mystery of this story is that we have no independent corroboration that the Greeks were engaged in this practice of jus prima noctis. This is really the only place where it is suggested that the Greeks enacted this kind of practice. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Gemara in Ketuvot, you see that this was really a practice instituted by the Persians. It was not known to be enacted, and also it is later recorded in history, the medieval period, but we have no evidence from any other source other than the commentaries on this particular story that the Greeks enacted this kind of barbaric practice of requiring any virgin before her marriage to spend the night with the leader of the enemy. Now, what we're going to do in the course of the next few minutes is try and develop a structure that helps us understand where this story comes from in reality and why it is attached to Chanukah, even if indeed the connections to Chanukah are very tenuous. The first stop that I'd like to go to before we pick up the story of Judith is an important statement by the Talmud in Tractate Psachim, which has to do with the institution of the mitzvah of drinking 4 cups of wine on the night of the Seder. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi in source number 3 is quoted as saying that Nashim chayavot be'arba'a kosot halalu, that not only are men obligated to drink 4 cups the night of the Seder, but women are obligated as well. Sha'af hein hayu ba'oto hanes, because women were also a part of the miracle. Ostensibly, what that means, they were part of the miracle of the emancipation from Egypt and all of the miracles that were involved as well. And when we look at an elaboration of this statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, we find that it repeats itself in a number of places in Masechet Shabbat, which discusses the story of Chanukah, and it tells us that women too are obligated in Nerot Chanukah for the very same reason. And this is this is brought down by the Gaonim as well, and they connect all of these rabbinic mitzvot where women are equally obligated as men because of this principle, sha'af hein hayu ba'oto hanes. Now, what do the words mean, sha'af hein hayu ba'oto hanes? In source number 5, you see the Rashbam in Tractate Psachim tell us as follows. In his commentary, he says, the Amar b'masechet sota, b'schar nashim tzidkaniot shayu ba'oto hador niga'alu, that it's not just that women were also part of the miracle, but they played an integral role. They played a central role in bringing about the redemption from Egypt. Because we know from the story in Tractate Sotah that the women never gave up, whereas the men had given up on building families and having children because they saw no future for the Jewish people, the Jewish women resisted that trend. They were always optimistic. They induced their husbands to have more children, and they created the proper environments where their husbands would want to have more children. And it was only through the encouragement of the women that we were able to leave Bishishim Ribo, with a huge multitude of Jews leaving Egypt. If it would have been left up to the men, there would have been a much smaller population of Jews, and that would have minimized the miracle. V'chein gabi mikra Megillah amar hachi mishum dal yedei Esther hava. And furthermore, says the Rashbam in his commentary to this Gemara, the same reason applies to the story of Purim. The reason why women are obligated in all of the mitzvot of Purim, including the reading of the Megillah, is because a woman played a central role in the Purim story, because Esther was the heroine of that story. And v'chein gabe Chanukah b'masechet Shabbat lashon Moreno Halevi. And similarly in the story of Chanukah. Now, what's amazing is that the Rashbam doesn't tell us what integral role did women play in the Chanukah story. He leaves it to our imagination. He's for Pesach, we have a Gemara that tells us what role the women played, is that they induced their husbands to have more children. In the story of Purim, we know that it is Esther who was the central figure of the whole miraculous salvation, together with Mordechai. But Chanukah, the Rashbam just tells us that women played a central role, as is recorded in the Gemara in Shabbat, which simply just says that women were part of the miracle, and does not identify any female figure in the Chanukah story. Now, to make things more interesting, we have a dispute between Rashbam and Tosafot in their respective commentaries as to how you understand this statement, Sha'af hein hayu ba'oto hanes. Tosafot tells us that, as a matter of fact, Af hein hayu ba'oto hanes does not at all imply that women played a special integral role, but rather that they too, Af hein, they too were part of the miracle. And so the opinion of Tosafot is that it's not that there was anything remarkable about the women of that time, but because we were all under threat, men, women, and children, women have to participate in this mitzvah as well. And the other important thing that Tosafot notes is that this idea of Af hein hayu ba'oto hanes applies only to rabbinic laws. When it comes to biblical laws, like the law of Sukkah, even though women traveled through the desert as much as the men did and sat in Sukkot while we were traveling through the desert, women are nonetheless exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. So anytime we find this principle, sha'af hein hayu ba'oto hanes, it is to reinforce rabbinic law. And we find this concept throughout the Talmud. As a matter of fact, it was in today's Daf Yomi Shiur in Masechet Ta'anit that many times Chachamim asu chizuk lidivrehem yoter mishel Torah, that the rabbis quite often will reinforce rabbinic law to make it even more impenetrable and subject to corrosion than biblical law. Biblical law, it was considered to be ironclad because people are very meticulous to fulfill biblical law. Rabbinic law is more subject to erosion over the course of time because people might not take it as seriously, and therefore the rabbis many times had to bolster rabbinic law and fortify its observance by creating extra safeguards around it. And as a result, the idea that women have the same level of obligation in certain time-related observances only applies to situations where the observance is of rabbinic origin and not of biblical origin. But we still haven't discovered who the characters are in the Chanukah story who are female and who played a central role. According to Tosafot, we are not required to identify any particular individual because as long as the women were under the same threat of either Hellenization or extinction as the men were, they should observe the mitzvot. But according to the Rashbam, and this is also the opinion of Rashi and many other of the medieval commentaries, if Afhein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes means that they played an integral, central role in the miracle, we have yet to identify who that person is. Now, as to Tosfos's question as to how to explain the language of Afhein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes, they too were involved in the miracle. That doesn't seem like they played a central role if you're saying they also were part of the miracle. So the Chatam Sofer has an explanation for that. And just to give you an analogy, what requires a greater level of miracle? Is it a greater miracle for God to save a righteous person and perform a miracle for them? Or is it a greater miracle when God saves a wicked person and performs a miracle for them? So just to answer that simple question, what miracle is greater, when God saves a bad person or when God saves a righteous person? So you would say it's a greater miracle when God saves a bad person more than when God saves a righteous person, right? Because you expect God to be more reactive to a righteous person than to a wicked person. And therefore, when we talk about the magnitude of miracle, because the women were more righteous in these generations of religious persecution and they adhered more to their faith, both in act and in creed, it is considered to be less of a miracle that God saved the women from annihilation, more so than saving the men from annihilation, who were more subject to the vicissitudes of religious persecution. And so that the Chatam Sofer of the 19th century just simply says, when the Talmud says Afhein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes, they too were part of the miracle. It means the miracle for them was not as great because we would have expected God to save the women. It's like the women and children are saved first when the Titanic is sinking, right? So we expected God to save the women. It was less expected for God to save the men. The magnitude of miracle for the men was greater, and therefore Af Hein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes means that the women too experienced the miracle, albeit not as great as the men. But it says nothing about whether or not women played a central role, and it is the Rashbam's contention, together with others, that women played a central role, and that is why they must be acknowledged and participate in the mitzvot of whether it's the 4 cups of wine, the reading of the Megillah on Purim, and the lighting of the Chanukah menorah. So in trying to find the earliest source for this idea about who this character or who the characters of the female characters of Chanukah are, the earliest that I'm able to find is in the 14th century, those quoted by the Rav Moshe Isserles himself, the Ran, and Sefer Kolbo. And he says exactly the way the Mishnah Berurah had quoted it, that the Greeks had decreed upon all virgins this practice of jus prime and noctis, and that and therefore and then he says Va'al yedei isha na'asanes, and it was through a woman that a miracle was performed. He does not identify her by name as Judith, but in the Sefer Kolbo, he does identify her with the name of Judith, and he says Kemoshe Meforash Ba'agada. This is contained in some kind of narrative that was extant in the 14th century when the Kolbo was written. We don't know exactly which kind of midrashic text the Kolbo is referring to, and as I will point out to you, we do have medieval references to this woman Judith and her association to Chanukah, but it's really, we don't have anything that goes back to the 14th century that directly links Judith to Chanukah. We have something close to that, which is the early 15th century, so it's close, perhaps it's close enough for us to be able to make the connection. But as you can see from the another 14th century commentary, the Abu Dirham, you'll notice that he says that this miracle and this woman Judith was done in a way where she decapitated Antiochus himself, who was the main protagonist in the primary narratives of the Jews against the Greeks. Antiochus is described in the different books of Maccabees. He's described in Megillat Antiochus, which is an ancient text as well. And this story, even though we have no record, no corroboration of the man Antiochus, who was the primary general in that area of the Seleucid Greeks who had dominated Eretz Yisrael, we have no corroboration that Antiochus was ever decapitated. Sefer Abu Dirham makes that claim. And so we have a bit of a conundrum. And in order to help us understand this, I want us to look at a classical commentary who will help us appreciate the fact that not everyone agrees that this woman Yehudit even lived during the times of the Chashmonaim. And it's based upon, before we see the Ben Ish Chai, the great Sephardic posek of the 19th century, it's important for us to look at another halacha, this time in the laws of Purim, where there's also an obscure custom to eat a certain kind of food. Yesh omrim, sheyesh le'echol ma'achal zir onim bepurim. Some people opine that a person should eat seeds on Purim, like sunflower seeds, poppy seeds. There is such a custom to eat, that's what we put mun, we put poppy seeds in our humintashen for those who have such a custom. It comes from over here, and it's the idea that you're supposed to remember a particular biblical character who lived off of seeds. Zecher lezir onim sha'achal Daniel v'chaverav bibavel. This reminds us of the fact that Daniel lived in Bavel. He lived as a vegan. And the reason why he lived as a vegan is because of kashrut concerns when he was in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And as a result, that was all that food that was available to him. So to remember that experience of living in the Persian or really Babylonian court that Daniel lived in, we have the custom to eat zir onim, to eat seeds. There's only one issue, and that is the story of Daniel does not take place at the exact time of the story of Achashverosh. By all accounts, the book of Daniel is taking place under the ruler Nebuchadnezzar, who is a generation or two before the story of Purim, the story of Achashverosh, who's a Persian ruler. The Talmud does create an association between Nebuchadnezzar and Vashti, his daughter, who's married to Achashverosh, but they're in the timeline does not coincide. Daniel is not living in Nebuchadnezzar's court at the same time that the Purim story is taking place. There is a suggestion that this man named Charvona or Hatach in the Purim story may be Daniel. However, it's Daniel at some later stage of his life. and not at the earlier stage when he's described in the book of Daniel as eating seeds. So this is a source of concern for the Ben Ish Chai. And he writes as follows: Ochlin ma'achei chalav b'Chanukah, zecher l'neis shenaaseh b'chalav. So first the Ben Ish Chai tells us that the reason why we eat dairy on Chanukah, this custom of eating dairy, is because of the miracle that occurred through milk, she'echila Yehudit et ha'oyev shehaya mimalchei Yavan, that Judith fed to the enemy who was among the rulers of Greece. V'hama'aseh huva b'sefer Chemdat Yamim. This story is discussed extensively. It is brought in very, very great narrative detail in a book called Chemdat Yamim, which goes back to either the 17th or 18th century. It's a little bit nebulous as far as the authorship of this work, but we know it was most likely written in the 17th century and first published in the 18th century. It is an anonymous work, and so some have questioned its authenticity, but there's a lot of research on this Sefer Chemdat Yamim. And there it identifies Judith, and it identifies Judith as being associated with the story of Chanukah. However, in the introduction to that story, the Sefer Chemdat Yamim writes that it may not have occurred at the same time as the Chanukah story. And the Ben Ish Chai echoes this, and he says, "V'neise naaseh kodem nes ha'ikari shel Chanukah b'kama shanim." This story happened many years before the main story of Chanukah. Now, as we will see, it may have been not only many years, but many decades and perhaps even centuries before the story of Chanukah. However, despite the fact that the timelines do not align between the Judith story and the Chanukah story, ho'il ve'oto oyev haya mimalchei Yavan, v'gam hu haya rotzeh laha'aviram al dat, but because the enemy in the Judith story was of Greek origin, he was a Greek ruler, and because he wanted to do the same thing that happened during the time of Chanukah and the Chashmonaim, which was to deter the Jews from practicing Judaism, lekach osim lanei zeh gam ken zecher b'mei Chanukah. It is for that reason that we make a remembrance of the Judith story on Chanukah, even though the timelines are completely disconnected from each other. Al derech she'amru le'echol zir onim b'purim zecher l'nei shel Daniel alav hashalom v'chaverav aleihem hashalom. And it's no different from the minhag on Purim to eat poppy seeds or seeds in general to remember the story of Daniel and his fellow Jews in Nebuchadnezzar's court, even though that was a generation or two generations before the Purim story. Venerally, and then the Ben Ish Chai concludes as follows. And I believe that the Ben Ish Chai is bothered with a fundamental question. As we're going to see from the story, this woman Judith feeds the enemy, and we haven't yet defined who he is. According to the Abu Dirham, it's Antiochus himself, which is very difficult to reconcile, and especially if you accept the Ben Ish Chai's depiction that it happened several years before, then it certainly was not Antiochus, because Antiochus was alive in the time of the Hasmoneans, so he could not have been decapitated by Judith. So then the question that we have to ask is, why not celebrate Chanukah with wine? I mean, if after all, it was wine that caused the intoxication of this evil ruler over the Jews, why not use wine as the way to celebrate that it was because she gave him wine that he became drowsy, he fell asleep, and she decapitated him? Why use milk, the dairy product, which was turned into cheese, which was salty, which made him thirsty, which caused him to drink wine? It almost sounds like Chad Gadya, right? In other words, what's the connection? Perhaps it would make more sense to have a l'chaim over a glass of wine to thank God for giving us intoxicants so that we can use it against our enemies instead of using dairy product. And he says, "V'nirali b'siyata dishmaya lirmos ta'am b'chalav lishlosha mitzvot shegazru levatlam." It would seem to me that the word chalav, which means milk in English, is spelled with three letters, Chet Lamed Bet. And he says these three letters allude to the three mitzvot that the Greeks attempted to deter the Jews from. There were three central mitzvot that the Greeks were against and tried to stop the Jews from performing because they perceived these three mitzvot as sort of central pillars of Jewish religious observance, and Shehem Chodesh, Shabbat, Milah, which were Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, two time-related mitzvot, and Milah and circumcision. And the Jewish people actually were willing to give up their lives in order to preserve these mitzvot. Now, we're not going to get into the reason why it was these three mitzvot in particular, but if you take the word chalav, you take the word chet of chalav, it's the first letter of the word chodesh, which is an allusion to Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. The letter bet, the last letter of the word chalav, is the second letter of the word Shabbat. And the letter lamed, which is the middle letter of chalav, is the third letter of the word milah, of circumcision. This is a bit out there, I would say, but he says in some way you can find some kind of connection between the three mitzvot that the Greeks sought to abolish and the word chalav. It's a very tenuous connection. I'm going to go a little bit further. And I want to point out to us something very important, and that is that there's a very suspicious and a story. What I say when I say suspicious, I should say that there's a very suspicious connection to a biblical story having to do with milk and cheese that really connects Judith to a biblical narrative. And of course, those of you who have studied the book of Judges, the Sefer Shoftim, are familiar with the story of Yael, who was able to get the Assyrian general Sisera to come to her tent, ostensibly to offer him sanctuary, and she offers him milk, and he becomes very thirsty, and then she gives him wine, and he falls asleep. Or over there, it doesn't say that she gave him wine. Over there, it says she just gave him milk, and the milk, perhaps because of the chemicals in the milk that make a person drowsy, he fell asleep. Okay, so it says over there, "Vateitze Yael likrat Sisra." We know the story. It's in the 4th chapter of the book of Shoftim. It's a well-known story, and she gives him initially. She hides him, and then he says to her, "Vayomer eleha hashkinina me'at mayim ki tsameti, vatiftach et nod hechalav vatashkehu vatechasehu." And she opens up her flask and she gives him milk, and this makes him drowsy. And then she, as the story goes, she takes the tent peg, she takes the yated, the peg of the tent. While he's sleeping, she takes a mallet and she hammers it into his head and she kills him. That is a story of a female being responsible for saving the Jews more than an entire army of people. Now, is it mere coincidence that the story of Judith is associated with dairy, or is there some connection to the story of Yael? So first of all, let me point out that there are a number of commentaries in the medieval period who say that it's not at all a coincidence. The Rama Mipano and a sefer called Midrash Talpiot, both dealing with the principle of resurrection or reincarnation, I should say, Gilgul Nishamot in Judaism, states as follows in source number 15, Yehudit shenaaseh nes Chanukah al yada, Gilgul Yael eshet chever hakeni mishoresh kayin. That Yehudit, Judith, is a reincarnation of Yael. Now, there are other commentaries. Kedushat Levi, Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, suggests that there are many times in Jewish history where we find a miracle being performed on behalf of someone who is the hero or the heroine of the story, but the hero or the heroine of the story behave in some strange manner which seems like they are succumbing to the sin of the enemy. And there is a reason for that. We see this in the story of Gidon, who, in the course of trying to get God to save the Jewish people, commits a number of sacrificial acts which seem like idolatry. And that was in order to suppress the idolatrous enemy at that time. And he says the same thing happened in the times of Devorah, and the times who was the leader in the times of Yael, in that because Sisera, the enemy, was a being who was who had very strong sexual urges, Yael was able to subdue him by doing something questionable in that area. And the narrative of giving him milk, which is a product having to do with reproduction, having to do with sexuality, is an allusion to the fact that Yael does something in a way to seduce Sisera, and that's alluded to by the use of this ingredient of milk instead of anything else, as an allusion to the fact that Yael used her sexual guiles in order to seduce Sisera and to cause his demise. Just wanted to point out as well the Sefer Seder Hadorot, which is written in the 18th century, also states that the Yehudit story did not necessarily take place in the times of the Chashmonaim. It may have taken place many, many years before, and I'm going to leave it at that for now. So let me talk to you about we're going to shift gears, and instead of talking about the historical character named Judith, I would like to speak with you about a book called Judith. Judith is part of what's called the Apocrypha. It is not part of the canonized Bible. However, it is one of what we call the Sfarim HaChitzoniyim, one of the apocryphal books that in certain strands of Catholicism is considered to be part of the canon of the Bible. But Judaism never adopted the Sefer Yehudit in its canon, and it's a little bit nebulous as to the story of Yehudit, whether or not it actually ever took place, because the characters in the story are not easily identifiable historically. And as a matter of fact, in my copy of Sefer Yehudit, the book of Yehudit that we have today, we only have the original in Greek, but it seems from historians that it was originally written in Hebrew and then translated into the Greek, but we lost the original Hebrew. So my version was done in a scholarly edition by the publishing house Yavna in Tel Aviv many years ago, through a professor Hartom, and he writes in his introduction, he writes a brief biography of the story of Yehudit as it appears in this literary work, which goes back to the biblical period. And he writes, or the late biblical period, I should say. And he writes the Sefer, and if it goes back to the biblical period, so then you know it certainly did not occur during the times of the Hasmoneans, which are clearly post-biblical by at least a couple of centuries. B'Sefer Yehudit misupar al melech echad hamechunen Nebuchadnezzar melech Ashur. And I'm just going to read the first few lines, maybe the first paragraph. The book of Judith, it takes place regarding a particular king who's named Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria. Now, of course, we don't know who Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria is. Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible is the king of Bavel. And so there seems to be some kind of misalignment immediately when we read the story in the book of Judith. Sha'asa milchama im Arpachshad melech Madai. He makes a war with a man named Arpachshad, who was the king of the Medians. Now, Arpachshad, those of you who remember your Sefer Bereshit stories, who is Arpachshad? He's one of the four kings that Avraham Avinu goes to war against way, way back. So there's a borrowing of names all throughout Jewish history, completely disjointed times and places. V'kara le'amim shonim uvetocham b'nei Yisrael lavo le'ezrato, achem dachu et kriyato. So this king Nebuchadnezzar, because he was engaged in a war against Arpachshad, calls all neighboring nations to come to his aid, including the Jews, and the Jews resist his call. La'achar shenitzach Nebuchadnezzar et melech Madai v'kavash et Achmeta birato. So after Nebuchadnezzar succeeds in his war against Arpachshad, it's now time for payback against the Jews who did not participate and did not come to ally with him. So shalach et chelo uvrasho hasar Olofernes. So he sent his army against the Jews to besiege Jerusalem, and he sends Holofernes, his general. La'alot. Now you may be familiar with that name Holofernes because that's the name that in many of our modern texts is associated with the story of Judith. La'alot al ha'amim shesarvu la'azor lo ul hashmidotam. And he goes basically to take revenge against those nations who did not come to his aid. Bnei Yisrael hitbatzru mipanav b'mekomot shonim uv'miyuchad ba'ir hanikret Baituluah. And the Jews at the time basically created fortresses for themselves, and they went in particular to a town or a city called Baituluah. We have no record of where this place is. And Holofernes sam matzor al irzo. And Holofernes besieged the city Baituluah. Maybe it's a reference to Jerusalem, we're not sure. V'tafas et kol hamayanot shebekirvata. He basically dries up or seizes all of the well springs. So he basically wants to cut off the water supply. And therefore he'll basically starve them to death until they surrender. Gavar hatzama ba'ir v'toshaveha darshu merashei ha'ir liftoch et sharei ha'ir lifnei ha'oyev. After 34 days of this siege, the Jews are ready to surrender. Rashei ha'ir hivtichu lem lasot kenim lo yashim Hashem b'toch chamisha yamim. And the leaders of the city say, we will surrender, just give us 5 more days. If if God does not perform a miracle to save us, we will surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. Bayamim ha'im yashva be'ir Baituluah isha achat almana mishevet Shimon u'shma Yehudit. And during this time, in the city of Baituluah, there is, and Baituluah could mean Bitula. It could be a reference to the Virgin. We don't know. Maybe it's a reference in some way to the city of Jerusalem, who's known as the Bitulach, wearing sackcloth, as she's described in the book of Eicha. So there's this one woman who's a widow, and she was from the tribe of Shimon, and her name was Yehudit, Judith. V'hi yafat toar, and she's very beautiful. Yirat Elokim v'nichbada ma'od, and she's God-fearing, and she's very dignified. Hi hochich et rashei ha'ir al hachlatam zo, sheyesh ba mishum nisui Hashem v'choser bitachon b'yeshuato, and she rebukes the city leaders for basically not having enough faith in God and agreeing to surrender in 5 days. Biksha reshut latzeit min ha'ir v'hivtichatam ki betoch hameshet hayamim yoshiem Elokim biyada. And so she requests permission from the city authorities. Let me leave the city. I will effect victory for the Jews, and I will do whatever I need to do, and God will help us. Ach lo gilta lahem mahu hadavar shebida'ata la'asot. But she doesn't reveal to them what she plans to do. And as the story goes on, I'm not going to read the rest of the text, but you have it here in your handout. It's actually quite extensive, and the Sefer Chemdat Yamim embellishes it even more. But essentially, in the book of Judith, the apocryphal text itself, it states that she goes to Holofernes, says to him that my people are ready to surrender, but they wish to appease you, and they want to offer you these gifts. And she takes some special bread and cheese and wine from her people of Baituluah, and she offers it to him, and she wins his trust slowly but surely. She's lives in the camp for several days with her assistant, and eventually she is able to win Holofernes' confidence, and he thinks one night she's going to give herself to him. And so, but she says, but first, let us have something to eat. You must be very hungry. You must be very thirsty. He eats the cheese, he drinks the wine, and that's when she decapitates him. And then Bachatimat HaSefer, we know the rest of the story, and the Jewish people are victorious. And at the end of the book of Judith, he writes, Mubeit Tfilat Hodaya Shel Yehudit V'yidiot Al Yameha Achronim Va'al Mota. The end of the book finishes with a prayer that Yehudit offers, and it talks about how she lived out the rest of her life, lived to a very ripe age, and then eventually she passed away. Okay. Now, Hakadmonim Ra'u B'Sefer Yehudit Sipor Histori. Earlier generations thought that this book was to be taken literally and that it was a historical narrative of an actual story. But Hakatolim Hemenu Ki Nichtav Ruach Kodesh, Catholics believe that it was written with divine inspiration by a prophet, and they therefore canonized it and included it in their Bible. However, when we take a look, and this is Professor Hartom speaking, when we take a look at the names and the places, they just don't add up. This, and then again, he reveals to us that this is what's going on, that this book may not be an accurate narrative of something that actually happened, or it may be an aggregate of stories of heroic women who acted valiantly and with great valor in different parts of ancient history. We simply don't know because the mists of time have really covered over the story, and it seems that the author or authors of this story deliberately obfuscated the actual names of the characters. What I'm going to conclude with is I've also included in the handout a sefer called Chadashim Gam Yeshanim, which was compiled by a Professor Heberman a number of years ago, which contains something called Megillat Yehudit, the Scroll of Judith, not to be confused with the apocryphal text of Sefer Yehudit. Megillat Yehudit is a text that was compiled in the medieval times. The time of publication as is recorded, of its writing as is recorded in the Megillah itself, is the year 1405 of the Common Era, so early 15th century. This was a text that was read in certain congregations in the medieval world in Europe over Chanukah, just like there were many communities who read or maybe continue to read Megillat Antiochus in the synagogues over Chanukah. Today, in most Ashkenazic communities, we don't have any special reading of any special texts, but just like Megillat Antiochus relates the story of the Hasmoneans and the miracle of Chanukah and finding the cruse of oil and lighting it and miraculously burning for 8 days, Megillat Yehudit was also a medieval text that pays homage to this woman Yehudit and more directly links her to the Chanukah story, citing her as being the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, which is what is cited by the Ran. This text, although it dates back to 1405, is most likely what the Ran and the Kolbo relied on, probably in an earlier iteration of this text, to create this story of Judith being associated with the story of Chanukah. And I thank Dr. Eric Lowy for finding or providing this text for me, but here you have a large portion of it. It goes on for many, many pages, and I've just copied the pertinent sections that will help you get your feet wet in this particular text. And so I'm going to conclude this shiur with the following theory. And I know that it is a bit daring for me to make this suggestion, but I want to get this point forward. We understand through our review that it is imperative for the rabbis to reinforce rabbinic law and make sure that both men and women are observing the holiday observances of the rabbinic institution of Arba Kosot, the rabbinic institution of Megillat Esther, and the rabbinic institution of Nerot Chanukah. When it comes to explaining why women have to observe Arba Kosot, it's because Afhein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes, which according to the Rashbam and other commentaries means that women played an integral role in the miracles that were performed for us when we left Egypt. When it comes to the story of Purim, Afhein Hayu Ba'oto Hanes implies that a woman was the central figure, the central character that was responsible for the miracle of Purim. When it comes to Chanukah, we are left with a bit of a dilemma. We do not have a central female figure to pin ourselves on, but we do know that there is a woman named Yehudit who has never been acknowledged. And if anything, we want to create some reinforcement for her story because her origins are somewhat nebulous, and we don't even know if she ever lived. And so we create an association between her story and the story of Yael, who never actually has been really commemorated in Jewish ritual or Jewish practice in any significant way. And in order to signify the importance of this Judith story, there is a minhag on Chanukah to eat dairy, which links Yehudit directly to the story of Chanukah and links Yehudit directly to the story of Yael. And so, if we're going to accept this, first of all, I don't want anyone to think that there's anything heretical in what I'm suggesting. We are dealing with historical anachronisms that really are very difficult to reconcile. If a person chooses to believe that Yehudit was actually the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, kol hakavod, more power to them. We simply don't have any historical connection that indicates this, or any independent corroboration of this, nor does it make sense that there was this daughter who simply just appears out of nowhere in the first time being the 14th century. Because before then, there is absolutely no record before the 14th century of Yochanan Kohen Gadol having a daughter that plays a central role in the miracle. And as a result, it would seem to me that the history is not accurate. The connection that is created, however, between Yehudit and the story of Chanukah bolsters the rabbinic law that women must participate in the mitzvot of Chanukah, particularly in the lighting of the menorah, which is really the singular mitzvah of Chanukah, in addition to saying Hallel and Hoda'ah, giving thanks to God, which women are going to do anyway. As long as they're davening, they're going to be doing the prayers anyway. But the particular physical commandment of the holiday of Hanukkah, which is to light the menorah, is signified as something that women play a central role, so that women will feel connected to the mitzvah and perform the mitzvah together with the men. That's my idea. That's my suggestion. That's perhaps why this whole Yehudit character is created and associated with Hanukkah and is bolstered by her connection to Yael. And that creates, again, an integral association to the custom of eating dairy, so that we feel a sense of validation that this is a legitimate central figure of the Hanukkah story. Okay, I hope this is helpful for you. If it was unhelpful for you, I apologize. But I think, for the sake of just trying to acknowledge what happened historically, what didn't happen historically, it's sometimes helpful to sort of peel back the veil and to get a glimpse of really what's going on in many of these religious practices behind this very nebulous aspect of Hanukkah, which hopefully you have a little bit more of an idea of what the history behind it is. Okay, so with that, let me wish you all a happy Hanukkah, and and wherever you are in the world, celebrate it well with lots of joy and be safe. And Bezrat Hashem, we'll see you all soon. Take care.